Welcome to the second episode of Future Form with Lauren Franco. Thanks for joining me again. Today I'm speaking with Marina Otero Verzier, an architect, researcher, curator, and educator whose work examines how architecture intersects with digital infrastructure, labor, extraction, and ecological crisis. Marina's research makes visible what is often treated as invisible: the material, environmental, and political costs of data, automation, and so-called immaterial technologies. In 2022, she received Harvard's Wheelwright Prize for Future Storage, Architectures to Host the Metaverse, a project investigating new architectural paradigms for data storage at a planetary scale. She has held leadership roles across institutions including Design Academy Eindhoven, Het Nieuw Institute, and Columbia GSAP, and has curated major exhibitions such as Work Body Leisure at the Dutch Pavilion of the Venice Architecture Biennale and After Belonging at the Oslo Architecture Triennale. She is currently a lecturer at Harvard, where she continues to explore the intersection of digital infrastructures, climate catastrophe, and education. What I hope this conversation offers is a chance to unpack the architectures behind our digital lives and to think more critically about responsibility, care, and imagination in a world increasingly shaped by data. Future Form with Lauren Franco. Lauren Franco. Future. You're listening to Future Form with Lauren Franco. Marina, thank you so much for being here and speaking with me today. I'm really excited to learn from you. You move fluidly between architecture, research, curating, and teaching. How do these roles work together toward your larger goals? And do you still think of yourself as an architect? Or has that category become insufficient for the kind of work you're doing now?
Well, I think every category is always insufficient. It's just a way to try to delimit fields that are always overflow. So I still consider myself an architect. And because that's somehow the cases, it is also, let's say, a legal question, because I'm qualified to operate technically as an architect than what I'm allowed to do technically, let's say, by my degree. And that spans many fields, including many of the things that you already mentioned. What I always understand is that I'm interested in questions, so like particular themes or projects, like actions, and those just to intervene in from one perspective. So, for instance, I'm interested in data centers through the lens of design, like architectural design, but also I think it's important to have a pedagogical approach to it. I also think that advocacy, public opinion and knowledge is created through publications and exhibitions. So at the end, I'm interested in one aspect of something, but then I try to use different to intervene in that particular area.
Thank you. That is really what inspired me to reach out to you. It's really motivating to see someone who's able to wear so many hats and work across multiple disciplines so effectively.
Training as an architect involved always been in contact with many other professions. We are always in conversation with other areas of knowledge. Because of the type of projects we do, like we always work with larger teams, and that also creates, we could become generalists, it's true, but at the same time, we feel comfortable jumping into new topics all the time, because maybe there is a new project that needs you have to become an expert in, healthcare, because that's your next project, to be open to listen to people who knows much more than you and, take notes.
Definitely. Can you talk a bit about your early environment or upbringing? Were there experiences or places that shaped how you think about these systems?
I was an artist, and I was always, in an environment that was creative, family, let's say. So in many ways, I already was open to questioning many categories and normative ways, in a way that I wanted or wished, but in a way that helped me in a way to be open to other ways of living and understanding the world, art and culture, and soon architecture. I think in my family, there were different people involved in architecture. And to me, that was also a field that mixed in certain ways that I'm also very intrigued and always inspired by. My sister is a writer, and my mom is someone always very, very interested in literature, political in certain ways. My mom's side went into exile during the Spanish Civil War. And that I think in certain ways that also about, forms of inequality, different forms of violence, and a sense of responsibility toward making the world a reason for my family to have to be on exile. Mm-hmm. So I think this experience has shaped inevitably who I am.
Thank you. It's great to get an idea of where you're approaching these questions from. And much of your work challenges the idea that digital technologies are immaterial. Why is it politically and architecturally important to insist on the materiality of data, AI, and the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I'm immediately the field where I imagine I will be practicing. And then I moved to the Netherlands, where I became director of research at Het Nieuw Institute and Digital Culture. These were three institutions that's because my role as director of research, I have to look into projects that combine architecture, design. But digital culture was not my area where I started to be very, very interested. Obviously, I had a team with experts in the different fields, and we have to look into projects that will be looking at the future of the profession, advice to the government, to also support the profession conversations, debates that will be relevant for society. And within that framework, we started to look into automation. Sure, there were many different architectures that were automated. And ultimately, it was also a question of society and territory, because this new development in also the understanding of architecture as something like an entire discipline focused on the factories didn't have so many human bodies. And if they had, they were not at the center of this history throughout these transformations of labor culturally, but also, how these industries were taking shape. So the architectures, and then we started to understand all the systems that are underpinning their functioning. And obviously that's how the digital infrastructure emerged, cables and many other systems that make possible to have, the conversations we are having right now through the internet. Is that we are always told that the cloud is immaterial, and we imagine that these communications happen through waves. And yeah, but in many cases of satellites and cables and data centers that consume energy and water, heavy equipment. And in order for those to work, you need to have open minds, sizes, and we have computers and telephones and servers and CPUs and chips. So all that is so material, but most of the time it's invisibilized. So my entire work has been always trying to unveil that infrastructure, that it was not hidden, it was in front of us, like enchanted, by this idea of the immateriality of this infrastructure. It was never immaterial. And my role was to visualize why they are where they are and what are the implications of their functioning.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I was reading your essay, Compulsive Desires, and you write, the smooth touch of screens, the experience of minimum latency are products of the greed for what is below. It's almost knowing ignorance that we accept the allure of technology and then don't look into what lies beneath it.
We are aware of the trains and the planes and the infrastructure that made it happen, because sometimes it's annoying, and just kind of, it's heavy. It's like the sound is noisy, and we know it's polluting in the case of the air industry. But with the internet and our digital existence, everything is designed to be very smooth. And it's kind of user to see everything what is behind. But what is behind that is also noisy and heavy and polluting and etc. But the end, spaces for interaction are seemingly smoother than in other infrastructures that we use.
Yeah. I also have a follow-up question too. You're talking about how this relates to actual labor and bodies is also, and bodies are made invisible by these infrastructures, or how do you kind of question whose labor this is?
What I like about doing long-term research projects is that maybe I have initially hypotheses, that the hypothesis that we had when we started the work on automated landscapes in the Netherlands was that labor was completely being disrupted and that robots were taking over. That was also what we were reading in the press, and the human labor is completely displaced or is reorganized. So what happens is that factory workers, in the way they were used to operate, but that doesn't mean there are not other people that are managing also the operation of machines. They are in front of kind of heavy machinery that you can see in the port of Rotterdam. So the number of employees in the port of Rotterdam but the type of work is different. Some workers, for instance, were driving cranes across the port and the harbor. That's now the cranes are like, overseeing the operations from an office space. So there is a change of type of labor. And also with that comes a type of, makes the city of Rotterdam, because that was always a working city. But now it has become much more service oriented because the type of workers that are in the harbor are different. And those other workers, instead of being into the new developments in the port, most of the times are displaced. So they have to go somewhere else. So that happens often. Also, perhaps labor, they have migrant workers, but they are not there all the time. They have special visas for 90 days. They do their certain work and they are sent back to their country. Regimes of labor and economies appearing, and not necessarily saying the human body is not relevant, but in many cases is you invisibilize in other ways. This plays also to the point that, people like render farms by Liam Young was looking in how the renders made by softwares or even AI, but they are developed in many cases in render farms in places like Pakistan, with workers being paid below standard studios in order to develop the dreams and the images of these studios. And we see that operating all the time. Or when we imagine that AI operates also with army of workers, that training AI for recognizing and also setting security measures, etc. So at the end, this technology is smooth, but in order to operate, they still need a lot of labor. That's not the case of data centers, though. It's the opposite. They promise that they are going to offer installed. And the reality is that most of the times, despite being huge infrastructures directly, it doesn't mean that they don't create economies and jobs in other parts because of developing the components, mining, creating digital infrastructures, etc. But the data need to be by a human team to be run.
That explanation is very helpful. It makes it much easier to understand how this all operates at a much larger landscape or even planetary scale. And something I'm really interested in within that is the role of extraction, this idea of green colonialism. It's not just about the construction of these data centers themselves, but also where the materials come from and how they're sourced and extracted, which is something maybe not everyone is thinking about when they're typing into an AI prompt, let's say. Could you talk a bit more about that side of it?
And we started looking into digital infrastructures. We were following the cables, right? Like the tubes and cables and landscape, the full geography of the cloud. And we are elements, rare earths, minerals that are fundamental for the digital infrastructure. One of them is lithium. And the reason why we got fixated on lithium agency, on the one hand, has been praised as this kind of mythical element that will fuel us towards renewable energy. It's what makes mostly batteries and for electric vehicles, but also phones, not servers, but the batteries in data centers, solar panels, etc. But at the same time, lithium as a substance has been used for sleep disorder, but also different maladies connected to, exhaustion. And, lithium has been prescribed. In a way, lithium energizes the planet, promising that we can keep on consuming and producing as if nothing has happened. So even though shaping the planet, lithium comes as a promise of we can keep on have them electric, or we can keep on producing and consuming the same amount of energy, but we don't need perhaps fossil fuels because now we have batteries. But at the same time, is this because of, the amount of pressure and labor to which they are subjected. And lithium is the secret pill that allows you to be very interested in this dichotomy of the relation between the exhaustion of the planet and that of the body. And lithium came as that element that will allow us to think in those lithium extraction in Chile is one of the main producers and exporters of lithium, together with China and Australia. And we will applications and establish a quite intimate relation with Chile through that project. And then we also looked into how Europe be interested in having its own energy, to be independent energetically and strategically, like many different levels. And in places in Europe, including Portugal and the north of Spain, where I'm from. So I've been involved quite a lot. What is the cost of this so-called green energy project that nevertheless also destroy, really break mountains and the communities that depend on and live in those mountains? So these very extractive and destructive processes, in this case, on the name, like you. So for me, that paradox again, the same that the paradox of the cloud was something to investigate and to reveal the materiality. It's also depending on extractivism and creating very polluting infrastructures, displacing people, like killing wildlife. And well, it was something that also to use architectural skills to help visualize the real impacts of these industries. It's like, oh, well, then we don't use lithium, and then we keep on using fossil fuels. No, that's not what I say. But in a way, we have to understand the extent of our compulsive desires, the title of some of those projects. So that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, you talk about this cost and that there are larger costs than people initially might think. Especially, I wonder also, we often talk about maybe this technology as like this needed thing that needs to happen. Like, oh, we need this advancement. And again, similar to how the cloud is phrased, you just have this, I guess, continuous issue of how these if you can talk more about how through design and architecture and how you're saying kind of like this storytelling that you're able to sometimes also do through art, that it's not purely this technical transition, that it is this political and ethical question.
The thing is that in many cases, these infrastructures, whether they are, they in places that we experience every day. Most of the times they are in the outskirts of cities or like a more depopulated place of the consequences. And when we hear about them, we tend to abstract the conditions. So when we think that mine, we tend to abstract the life that happens in that territory. And we do it also as architects. Many times we are trained to as something abstract where we can operate from above. That's in many cases the training that we had as architects, we have to organize programmatically, and energy, people, like we have to organize them in kind of, structures as development or, a neighborhood or like just a building itself. So we are used to abstract. My work is to counter a little bit that logic to this question so we can see through a different perspective, saying that, yeah, okay, we need lithium for the transition. Let's see what this territory that you always imagine or is portrayed as the life, the ecological relations that happen there, highlighting that even the full of relations between beings that are fundamental for our lives, even at the level of the bacteria. That's happening, for instance, in Chile. It's not my merit, I know all these, even invisible links that are necessarily for the life on Earth. How many times are dependent on these very territories that we try to dismiss as, oh, nothing is really, these ecologies are fundamental for the functioning of the entire planetary system. So my work is in a way to highlight those you said flow in this territory. If they are disrupted, geography of more than 300 or 400 kilometers, all disruptions for this entire area are huge. So trying to say risk report, many times that involves working with teams that busy and actually help understand the implications with tools that are in order to make it more clear for a larger population how things will look calm and bureaucratic. So in certain way, that's why at the end is like, I think education is fundamental for training new generations, caring for the lives and the planet without innovation. So it's not that I'm not interested in technology, but I believe that it could be done differently. So in certain ways, you have to intervene in these questions. And I started to do that through lithium reports that are legal reports. And you have to be able to respond, your voice as a technician, as an architect, or as a biologist or as a geologist, and you have as well. But the facts are never enough. So you also have to conscious of these decisions that we are taking, apparently collectively, but many times publishing, giving lectures. But at the same time, I say, well, I'm going to offer a solution, because if I just criticize, be always criticized as it's not realistic. So I try prototypes for other ways of engaging with these questions, other architectures, out of frustration that, you have to operate a response to such huge questions that, well, this is too complicated to actually work on this, because vision towards, renewable energies is better to have a maybe like, oh, wait, let's think differently. Do we all need individual vehicles? Okay, what if we do that individual? What does it mean? So I think that's why it's very complex on different perspectives, that is always incomplete in a way.
Thank you. I think you need to attack these issues through these different methods. So I really appreciate that. I guess that is where the question of scale comes in. Prototypes you've made feel like one scale, and advocacy or getting involved in legislation is another, maybe. And then also what you were just saying about what do we actually need? Do we need to look into alternative infrastructures? Is it enough to rethink how they operate? Or is it a more radical question of how have we become so accustomed to thinking of, oh, I can just use AI to do this, or for $10 less, I can get this electronic device or cloud subscription without thinking of the cost to it. And therefore, we need to keep scaling up our infrastructure. And also whether we should ask these questions that point to individual behavior versus what large companies are doing.
How I see it argues that regulation is killing innovation. I don't think so. The industry is doing things this way, which I think is beyond it. And there are many different factors. Imagine the sign is very basic, and too basic for being such an important infrastructure. So a more sophisticated way, and it should, because ever the main infrastructure of the 21st century, and to be honest, the design that we have, how they are conceived, is really behind me and many other people alternatives. But while we developed and approved and implemented all over the world, so I say, okay, on the one hand, this infrastructure energy, they are consuming too much water. They are actually designed as for to accumulate all sort of data. They are not specialized in themselves of having certain types of data. That's, to give you an example, most of the data is secure data. That's what they are operating 24/7, because that highly sensitive data, that's why they are trying to be, private and secure and sensitive. Many data is like, it's ephemeral. Data that we don't need to store it for centuries, or data just consulted once a year. Max all the time, that it will be available once a day, it will be okay. And data that is shared publicly in big walls. So what I'm trying to say is that data centers of data, what I call ecologies of data, if we will design them according to, we'll make a bit less money but at the same time, for the common good, not for big profits for only few companies. But it will take time. So I start working with scientists, architects, and how to conceive this infrastructure differently, in my opinion, more as they are being built. You have to regulate them, because otherwise it's just kind of structures that are overflowing, and they are over with infrastructures, etc. So that's why I think about two of them. It's like, but actually to allow innovation to happen. And so then prototypes try to find things that are still not in the market, or they are be a bit more conservative. I know that there is a lot of pressure, but if you are right now asking you to give them a license, really, they support this development. And we know that. I mean, I'm not making this. So, and many people says that it's a bubble. So let's protect ourselves from this. See, these two things operating is not either or. It's like, it's different temporal right there, and try to regulate what already exists. And the other might take a leap how we want this to be in 50 years' time, or 20 years' time, or broad, but we can take it.
It'd be great to hear maybe more about one of the prototypes. Like, what was interesting about that was that it's maybe making a data center, looking at the heat created from it at a local scale.
An award by Harvard, traveled the world and visit different models for data centers types. So what I did is taking a little bit of inspiration from this prototype. And it's specifically connected to a scientific institution. These supercomputers that are powerful, energy and water, for scientific reasons. So it's not for cutting without a t-shirt and so, but to, respond. But yet, in any way, these infrastructures are also polluting. That is required to go through all the data, the origin of the universe, for instance, these supercomputers emit CO2 heat, the same that we feel they are developing tasks that are very heavy. So that heat has to be till the devices start malfunctioning. In that case, just this hot air coming from the simulations of the origin of the universe will affect a tree and it will bloom fruit earlier in the year. But when you think about it, the relation between this digital infrastructure more about the world, but in doing that, affecting the very world that we are depending on. So said, why don't we develop a system to reuse the heat into something that will work together with the environment into creating life? And so in RISE, is a laboratory in the northern part of Sweden, in Luleå, heat of data centers to grow worms, also to grow chickens that otherwise will have dry food. So I said, it will be the development of this laboratory into this other, but maybe with a traditional compost, where the computers are simulating the origin of the universe, and doing that is transferred to a vermicomposting machine that the worms that are very happy, just to put it very simple, with you transfer the heat, it arrives to these micro degrees Celsius, and they start digesting the earth and created these computational processes trying to understand the origin of the universe are actually supporting the origin of life. And I like it because they are so-called if the computational processes speed up and produce them if it's too high. So there's always have to be a balance between, and so that's the imaginary. Like, what if we start thinking about infrastructure? In that I connect with feminist servers, permacomputing will investigate forms where we still use infrastructure, the speeds, perhaps more attuned to the forces of, and the needs of the beings that inhabit this planet. Technology is not subjugating completely the Earth, but actually, obviously, it's a very small prototype. So, but in a way, opens up our imagination.
I think that's amazing. And yeah, even correct questions. And I guess also then people on board to work out all the
It's a big team. So for instance, Fernando is an expert in both worms and vermicomposting and coding in the development of the prototype and its different iterations. I liked it a lot. Also to be always surrounded by people who know from them. I think that's what keeps me also excited.
I'm also curious when you talk about these different resolutions, maybe on the scale of people immediately get it like a prototype, but then how something like a film operates or other media, as well as maybe how different topics you approach in different ways, like the Wet Dreams project, that feels different in tone. I don't want to categorize your projects in a way you wouldn't want them to be, but that maybe projects fall on a scale of how immediately you can implement them or what kinds of questions they are asking.
That's what I do. I think generally I have a few areas of find opportunities to develop them in different media. And I not try to put everything I know specific. So in certain ways, it's a bit more, let's say, to be implemented, want immediately to resolve something. In other cases, it's more like offering new vocabulary, offering new avenues of speculating, rational, and implemented right now. There are projects that are a bit more opening up question, solution, or way forward. And I try to like our somehow desire for accumulation of based on needs. It's not only that we need the space for accumulating data. It has become something beyond need. It's something about fear. It's something about fear to keep as much as we can, even if we don't consult it, even so corrupt. So when you go back to those photos that you're or in the cloud, you might not even find them, or the software will be different. It's actually so difficult to maintain digital files, even more than physical records. Nothing like a prototype will help us. It's something even at the level of psychology, what is operating in our lives in order to be driven by this accumulating more. So that requires other language, requires other temporalities, other type of projects. So I have these compulsive desires. So launching questions, opening up possibilities to think about who we are. It's about this idea of that we have about the possibility of let go in the digital space. So those are other registers because they are not necessarily fields of explorations, speculative, and that also is also needed. So that's more poetic, let's say, than when I advise. It's very technical, it's very practical. I use another type of skills that when I try to, I will make you, in a way, hopefully rethink your position in the world. But those things obviously need different engagement. I always put a bit more emphasis in one over the other, depending on the moment of my life where I am and depending on the urgencies and so on. But I think all of them are important. The problem is, I think, going to your point, the urgency cannot also prevent us from keeping us thinking broadly and speculating and imagining other worlds and be even more poetic. And, and I try to navigate those world challenge, not to be focused only on the here and now, but also allow things to expand our own.
Oh, thank you. When I was reading about your idea of data mourning, I think that's one of the ideas that when you also frame things in kind of an emotional way, it also reaches people in a different way. And all memory and remembrance and collective remembrance is different than storing this data. And also at different ways people have stored data over time. And so I also am wondering, maybe if you had unlimited resource, reimagine, or what are your ideas about reimagining how we store this data? Is it bringing certain collective back more to the physical or more local? Or, I'm curious about, is it almost a return to certain ways of storing data as before, as much as it is about rethink, maybe?
Maybe what I'm going to say is even contradicting different positions, but on the one hand, I believe that we should have more our data is stored and used. Before I was using the term sovereignty, because, for instance, in many struggles, important and for a reason. But the problem with sovereignty is that it still recognizes a form of ownership that in many cases are individual. I think what I would love is this idea of distributed agency, because over time, I came to realize, obviously, that people who has been done studies and they know much more, but it's not the only side of memory. Mm-hmm. That remembering is collective, that remembering is more than storing files in an external drive. It's something that is embodied and is relational and is cultural and social. So remembrance, and we also have mechanisms and rituals for collective forgetting, or not necessarily forgetting, letting go, but remembering differently. So you let go certain things in order to remember differently. And I like those rituals because they socialize, and they are not, most of the times an individual are social. There are devices like the quipu, this used by the Inca Empire, that they are these strings of different color and fiber and not direction. So the quipu Kamayo will remember, but by also touching, looking at the color, looking at the note. So it was an entire mobilization of the body and the disembodied forms of memory, that is memory that, is a smell or is something like touch, something that they cannot be stored so easily in a device. Similarly, my grandmother had Alzheimer, and you see how her lack somehow compensated by all of us carrying her memory. Or I had a collective gathering with my, at a reunion. And it was funny because they were remembering parts of my life, like, oh, do you remember that moment that you did that in the, I'm like, no, I don't. That's who you are, because other people also remind you of who you are. So to me, that means that sovereignty is not enough dealing with data. So I'm more into this idea of form of collective managing, collective ownership, collecting memory. Neighborhood base is like, I don't know, it's a cooperative. I don't know. That's something we have to decide, but it operates more like that. Big tech is offering us, and we are paying for to store our data. So not so easy. They are touch so many parts of you. And I don't have anything against people who feel so attached to their memories that they do need some reassurance for them to be stored. I just want to let them know that they are digital storage, also there goes forever. So probably it's better to share those stories with many people who are, the one. That's what we have done as a society, and we keep on doing. But in a very destructive manner, let's say. The problem is that it homogenizes and puts to the fringes stories that are such by the algorithm.
Collective memory is a beautiful thing, as well as like collective knowledge and kind of being part of sometimes an institution comes in. And so I wondered if you'd be able to talk a bit about that, because I know you've written and have been part of many, as well as, of course, being an educator seems like a very large part of your life, how that plays into all of this.
At the end, we organize ourselves in larger bodies through institutions whether they are, you call it like a museum or like government or a family structures. So I've been always interested in the architecture of institutions, how they are constituted, what are their limits, how they are. And I've been working in institutions, like let's say universities, museums, and that has been very revealing. So many of those projects that we have been discussing, working with archives, the National Archive of Architecture in the Netherlands, the transition towards digital born files. So I've been experiencing firsthand these transformations to store this project and not this other, what it means to collect this history and not this other. What do we do with all these legacies that are like excluding many voices? What do we do with that? So those have been my questions for a long time. And a few years ago, I got this award from Harvard that allowed me to do research around the world, and that kept me busy. So I couldn't be in one institution. And the other is I felt somehow exhausted about the model of institution, universities or museums. I felt that were not enough to respond to the world and the challenges of the world. And I tried to find other paths, and I engaged more in direct work. Has always been politically active, but probably in the last years has been more. I tried to be closer to these communities protesting data center, work with collectivity that is less institutionalized, but not necessarily less organized. I felt compelled to do that because before university, a state institution, and I felt that the type of work that I was doing was, equal from the positions I had. I've been working independently and also trying to figure out if I was criticizing these institutions and tried to find other ways of operating, do I still think that ever? I'm not against institutions. It's simply that I had to find other ways of working that pace or try to make those limits between one and another more porous. That has required time. So I think institutions are very complicated spaces, society work. And honestly, otherwise, if we don't have certain spaces where there's certain form of trust and certain forms of agreement on how to regulate, protect each other, I think the opposites that in certain ways we are seeing these days is very dangerous. So I'm committed towards finding the way. I think that's the next phase of my work, to try to, I never left them, but I teach at Harvard or Columbia, but I'm not a full-time professor. I work with institutions, but I not have always at least one foot outside to keep it grounded to things that are to me very urgent. And I wanted to be focused on that. Let's see, going back to institutions, but where I can continue doing the work I'm doing right now and take into the next stage, let's say at the level of prototyping or work through the support that a big institution can give you.
That's great that you're able to kind of at this point in your career strive. I think also when you're saying about kind of building trust again in these institutions in a way, or in some way, or even like radical protest starts with students at institutions and people. So in a way, sometimes your greatest impact, as impactful as maybe what you're doing outside the institution, is also to continue to ask the same questions and kind of build a larger network of people maybe researching these same
institutions
things.
Are ours. That's what I learned. If we don't have them, that's a problem. We can criticize them. We should. But at the same time, we need. I think I was very exhausted when I was working in these institutions because I felt all the time I was facing a wall. And is that in many cases, I can help movements in Chile, in Spain, and so on, because I have affiliation with institutions. Local communities who were protesting against data centers in Chile told me, you have a Harvard email account. People will listen to you, more leveraging my somehow CV that is, very linked to very big institutions. And that gives me certain, let's say, voice that my words are legitimized, which is unfair because it is a fact that these local communities who have been experiencing much more because they experience it every day. But their voice perhaps is strong, but sometimes they need someone coming from an institution to validate them, which is awful, but it's of, the institutional and the power and the peril of those, like this validation that comes when I'm asked for doing that. But at the same time, you realize that, there is a still important part of the work I do. Like I've been invited to contribute to the trajectory of the institutions I've been working for. I can be advising a municipality because of my experience as well in these institutions. And whether I like it or not, my work is shaped by the trajectory I had throughout different institutions and the forms of validation they offer me. So I'm trying to work around it, how these forms of validation can be less exclusive and excluding, and how they can, help intervene in difficult realms, and get educated. But none of the projects that I'm working in are easy. They are always gray zones of operation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good kind of call for people to take up, that question the hierarchical structures in them, then also, to your point, look at how that can help.
Exactly. And how to make institutions responsible, but also understand how important they are for for society. Yes, we can make them better.
Yes, that's very true, that we need to acknowledge both what institutions can do for us, but also how we need to shape them. Now I want to pivot a bit to the last segment of the podcast, which is where I like to get an idea of how people enter their creative mode.
I wonder if you can talk a bit about your kind of daily creative routine or rhythm.
Yeah, I think to me, everything is very inspiring. So I try to make space for being in that zone that I become a bit more emails and requests. You don't have time to be receptive to things that happen around you. So creating those spaces is fundamental. Whether it is a walk in the park or a conversation with someone, or, just reading or watching something, that's very important. So in a way, my only methodology is to be curious and to find curious and not just productive. And that's not easy, but in a way, it's what it is. That's why my work is very contemporary, because most of the times it's just curiosity about things. And I'm like, I want to learn more about it. I want to learn more about digital infrastructures. I want to learn more. So things that maybe are around us, and create the time for that. I'm like, how does it work actually? So it's very like that. I remember when I was a student at Columbia, I was totally absurd that we have to do. But it was a stupid assignment that I gave it to myself. I don't have it anymore, but at the moment of the blog, that was called 365 poor tales. And I had to post every day 3 photos that I will take, a story that could be very, very basic. And I will not explain, it will be just 3 photos, and the 3 photos will make a tale. So imagine I suddenly realized, I have to do the post. So that will force me to dress up, go out, look around to try to find the storyful, because in a way it was like, regardless of how busy I am, I still have to find time to be surprised by the world and find those stories that are there. But if I just take half an hour and look at the world, I will be totally fascinated. And I think that's how I operate. Maybe I don't have the blog right now, but I still try to find these poor tales that are low resolution, but at the same time very generative.
Smiling because I also try to kind of give myself tasks like that, whether it's like making a collage or necessarily have an end result that the world is seeing also, I think is important.
Finally, what's a question we must ask before embracing the next technological solution? This touches on a lot of what we discussed today about how we sometimes easily embrace a lot of these things we are talking about with technology and feed into the lust and shininess of it all.
Why? I think many times we just accept technological innovation because it's sold as such. And if we don't use it, we feel behind. Why do I need that? Is that making my life better? Is that making the life of others better? And actually, is it making it just slightly better? But the cost, because sometimes we are just very attracted to novelty and to the latest of the latest. And I cannot compete to that. But in a way, now I'm against AI. I would like to see AI bringing, knowledge into, health, due to new vaccines or new methods of preventions to which we don't have, any remedy. And, that how come? Yeah, obviously, I would love to see that happening. But what I see happening, low in the zone with very stupid videos, and that nevertheless cost so much to our planet. I'm not going to be the police, of the internet preventing you to do that. But in a way, it's like, really? Like, why? See the world that is stunning, is surprising as well. It's like, that's why sometimes we don't know if AI are. So even more than AI. So just go outside, and instead of being infrastructure that costs so much to the planet and to many communities, just to make a scene with Trump without T-shirt, like we don't need that. So the question is like, I try not to judge, but just explain me why is that so important to you? Like,
no, I think that's a great note to end on. That in some ways it's maybe not this huge question of that will awake everything of why do this at all? Do you need to participate in this, or the non-digital world good enough?
Because I'm very curious. It's like maybe someone gives me more pleasure that then I cannot compete. But in certain ways, most of the time, that's not the response. That's not the response I had when I had the question about. Sometimes I'm like, check your phone and look at the 10 pictures. That will tell so much about yourself, things that you might not want to know, because those pictures, most of the times, are not important. Are screenshots of things that you fear to not relevant. It's not that you are taking a picture of your beloved one, and very few, most of the times, are like, but those things you don't delete either. And they keep on doing that. But this accumulation of this trend, either by individuals or companies or scientists, everyone not wanting to let go. And I invite everyone to go to your photos and see what is very funny, to be honest. And it's an exercise that I try to do. So, for instance, I can tell you, 2 photos of a friend in a bar, one a wall text in an exhibition that I decided not to read because I said I don't have time, so I just take a photo and I read later. One announcement of things, 2 screenshots of something, of a ticket that I also have online, but I don't know, just in case to reach it faster. Actually, 3 screenshots of that ticket that I fear to forget, and 2 images of a friend and one of my cat. Okay, that's what I don't need, but I just don't fear I will not remember, and I'm in a rush. So that's what says about me, and this is not the word. So sometimes, it tells you about you don't remember, or that you fear you will lose. And sometimes are your pets, your friends, and sometimes just very banal stuff as well.
I'm now looking at my own photos, and you're right. A lot of it is stuff you can remember to go back to later, or things like that. And it's like that's even stored in multiple places. Why do you need to store it again?
But I also had once one person that had 10 images of their partner, and all of them were very similar, just with very small differences in the position of the mouth and the eyes. And that person didn't want to delete that. Every single small gesture was a world. And I understood. So I'm not the one to tell you what is relevant to you. My question is why you keep what you keep and what it tells about you and the world.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great note to end on, that I think these questions and the questions you're asking open up people's minds to think about the largest level of infrastructure and territories, and maybe larger politics and government, but also the scale of what a person even chooses to store does say something about their own motives. So thank you for this conversation, and people will enjoy listening to it.
Thank you for having me, and all these important questions and the conversation that I really appreciate.
Thanks for listening to the second episode of Future Form with Lauren Franco, where creativity meets climate, culture, and change. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you continue to tune in. Bye for now.